to welcome everyone to the 2023 The Best Tree for Your Site program. I know many of you, but my name is Carrie Brown, and I'm the Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension Educator for OSU here in Fairfield County. And I'm joined here today by Tommy Springer, the Education and Wildlife Specialist for Fairfield Soil and Water Conservation District. Good morning, Tommy, or good afternoon, Tommy.
Yeah, good afternoon at this point, and yeah, it's kind of an off day for February, 70-some degrees, and I'm sure some of the people that were registered are probably taking advantage of that nice weather to be outside and doing that rather than staring at a computer screen like we are currently.
And I cannot blame them at all. But who knows what to expect in February? Typically, it's not 75-degree weather, but you just don't know. So Tommy's going to start by providing you with some tips on evaluating your site to ensure that you're choosing the best site for your tree and the best tree for your site. And then I'll highlight all of the species that are available in this year's tree sale. And then we're going to take a deep dive on 7 of those species and explore some of the considerations to keep in mind when planting them. We'll take a quick look at proper planting techniques for bare root seedlings, and then Tommy's going to share the details on the soil and water tree sale. So with that, I will hand the reins over to Tommy.
All right, and as we all love technology, I don't do this enough, so if I screw this up, let me know, but I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully this works. All right, everything look good on your end, Carrie, on everybody else? See
good to me.
See the slides? Okay. If you don't, speak up and let me know. But
okay.
You know, we're gonna, as Carrie said, we're recording this, so if you're viewing this at some point down the road, these tips that we're going to provide are you know, not just for Fairfield County, not even just for Ohio. These are tips for planting trees that you can take wherever you happen to live. But we'll go, and again, this is just a general overlook on things to consider for when you plant a tree. Carrie's going to get into the details of the trees themselves, but this is actually just site selection stuff. So I was curious, and I looked it up just before we came on here earlier, and I make the comparison of planting a tree is similar to buying a house, and I'll get some eye rolls from time to time, like, what do you mean? Well, the average home ownership right now in the United States is 8 years. So from the time you buy a house to the time you leave that house for whatever reason is 8 years. Well, trees tend to live a lot longer than 8 years, even some of our more short-lived and fragile species. So, you know, this is a long-term investment. When you're choosing a tree, you know, if you're buying a tree from our tree sale, there are these little tiny seedlings anywhere from 12 inches tall, some of them up to 2 feet tall. And you think, what are you talking about, a long-term investment? Well, where you put that tree generally is where it stays for the rest of its life. And you know, if we're talking about oaks, when that tree turns 200 years old, it's still a kid. So that tree is going to be there for a long time. So it really is a long-term investment. And then, as any good realtor will tell you, when it comes to buying a house, same goes with planting a tree. It's all about location. So location, location, location when selecting that. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And then when we get into that planting a tree, you know, part of that long-term investment is what's that growth rate and maximum size of that tree. So again, it's going to be here probably much longer than you or I are going to be there after we plant it. But some trees top out at different sizes. Some grow much faster than others, and I'll kind of talk about some of those. And then, you know, when we talk about the location, you know, nearby structures, meaning your house, whether it's a garage or your neighbor's fence or things like that, utility lines, and then of course other trees. So if there's already trees there, consider that as well. And then I'm not going to get into this a whole lot. I'm not a soil scientist. I work for the Soil and Water Conservation District, but we have other folks here that are more specialized than I with soil. But I do want to highlight some of the different things on soil class, drainage, of course, sunlight. If you grow any type of plants, you know that sunlight's very important. And I'll show you how you can find some of this soil information at home without visiting us, without, you know, coming in and pulling up an old paper soil map. There are web resources that you can use to find that information pretty much anywhere you live, with a few exceptions that I'll talk about. And then kind of the last thing I'll touch on are some of the aesthetics to consider. mess as far as, is the tree itself messy? You worry about that. And then some trees actually can be toxic to other plants more so than toxicity to humans. That's what I'm going to talk about with that. So this is a question I get asked when we sell trees. We sell single trees here at our tree sale that are a little bit larger, and then we sell in packs of 5, 25, or you can even order quantities of 100. But the question is, maybe you have a small yard at home and maybe you only have room for one tree. And the question I get asked is planting one tree even worth it? What's the point? The short answer is yes. Is a single tree beneficial? Absolutely. You look at the landscape here pictured. If that tree wasn't there, it would just be, again, that monoculture of grass. And by adding a single tree, regardless of the species, you're creating not only habitat diversity, but also shade, other things that we'll talk about. So if you're worried that you don't have 10 acres to spread out 100 trees on, and you just want to buy a single tree and put in that one, prime spot in your yard where that one tree will fit, go for it. A single tree, highly beneficial. And when we talk about the growth rate max size, most even our fastest growing trees grow maybe slower than, say, a human would, who reaches a adult age at 15, 16 years old. Trees generally take a lot longer. And there's a lot of quotes that kind of highlight that. If you want to get in philosophical, Nelson Henderson, this quote I have here on the screen. The true meaning of life is to plant trees under the shade that you're never going to sit. So those trees are going to take longer than our lives to reach maybe an appreciable size where the shade is actually there. So again, that long-term investment may be altruistic in nature. So you're spending the money, you're spending the time to plant these trees that maybe you're not going to get a full enjoyment or full fulfillment out of, but the next generations will. So that's one of the kind of the things when it comes to planting trees. Of course, one of the other often quoted ones are that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, because these trees do take a while. And the second best time to plant a tree is today. So if you haven't planted that tree yet, get out there, get something, whether whether you're getting it from our tree sale or somewhere else, but get out there and plant that tree now, because there's no time like the present, because we can't go back in time. With that being said, I kind of put together this little quote that says, also be considerate of those future generations. So where you plant that tree is going to affect multiple generations down the road. In this picture, I forget where I found this, and I'm not even sure how they managed to grow that tree in such a tight space between the house structures. But yeah, it might be fine now, but at some point that tree is going to be growing into the house or pose a hazard to wind damage or some type of damage where that's going to cost a significant investment, whether you hire a tree company or whether that tree comes down and damages that house in this picture. So again, I'm not even sure how they accomplished this particular planning, but that's something to consider when you're planting that tree. Think of how big it's going to get down the road and potential problems it may cause, maybe not for you, but for whoever inherits your property after you're gone. This little graphic put out by the Arbor Day Foundation is a great thing, because a lot of times when you see trees advertised, they don't give specifics. So it's not going to tell you this tree is going to get to 47 feet and have a trunk diameter of 24 inches. They're generally used and grouped by these sizes, and I kind of put the arrows on there. So we've got our shrubs, which are our bushes, things like viburnums. They're going to top out at less than 10 feet. So those are probably suitable for planting near structures. Then we're going to kind of move up the chain. You've got your small trees. Again, I'm not going to read all the list here. You guys can see that, but things like dogwoods and redbud, and in some extreme cases, the trees are going to surpass what you see in the graphic. But when you see a small tree, that's kind of what they're talking about. That 20 feet tall canopy spread is about equal to the height on some of these. Medium trees, again, are that 40 to 50 feet. And then finally, your large trees like the oaks. And then I kind of laughed at there at the far right, the ponderosa pine and redwood, not something we're going to see very frequently here in Ohio. But the plane tree, it was curious that they included that. Our version of the plane tree is the sycamore. So if you see plane tree and you don't understand what they're talking about, think of the sycamore trees. For you locally here in Fairfield County, if you've been to the fairgrounds, they've got some massive sycamore trees basically between Fair Avenue and the grandstands that are well over 100 feet tall. So those trees can get massive. Again, might not grow that tall in our lifetime, but as we look generations down the road, those are the size you can expect those trees to reach. Another thing that some trees, if you're looking to buy it, the description will tell you what kind of growth pattern they have. And if it doesn't, like if you're looking at the tag of a tree at a nursery, or you're looking at our tree sale brochure, I don't think it goes into this detail, but this is something that you can look up, and generally without pruning, so keep that in mind, this is without human intervention, tree species will naturally gravitate towards kind of a defined shape. And you know, we've got round and spreading and pyramidal there on the upper right. It's kind of the most recognizable. Think of our spruces and pines. They form that general shape. Obviously, if you prune them, you can drastically alter that shape. But keep that in mind too. Conical ones, you know, like the arborvitae or the cedar trees, again, so if they maintain that tight growth shape, you can plant them in tighter spaces. Something like the vase shape, like our dogwoods, spreading like oak trees, or you know, weeping like our weeping willow is the large version of that. Again, it helps you to be cognizant of where those branches may go into the future, with it starting as a pencil-sized seedling that you're sticking in the ground. One tree that is one of my personal favorites, it kind of defies any shape, I guess pigeonhole, if you will, are red buds. They don't get very large. They're what I would consider a small tree. Again, that 20 to 25 feet, but they remind me, their natural growth habits remind me of something like a oversized bonsai tree. They stick branches out in random complete directions, even more so than that irregular shape down in the bottom right of this illustration here. But I've got 2 red buds planted 20 feet apart in my yard. One is a beautiful form, looks like that vase shape here in the drawing, and the other one has just got branches going every which direction, makes it a real pain in the butt to mow around. But just be aware that red buds follow no set template as far as how they're going to grow. So you're flip a coin with how that's going to end up if you decide to plant red buds. Beautiful tree, again, one of my favorites, but I don't think they can be tamed even with really aggressive pruning. All right, so when we talk about growth rate, again, the size of the tree, the mature size of the tree doesn't always illustrate the growth rate. Again, flowering dogwoods, small tree. I know when I was younger, I assumed, well, small trees, they get to that size the same as an oak tree, and then they just stop growing. Well, things like flowering dogwood are just slow growing trees. Again, in my front yard, I did an alternating planting of red buds and dogwoods. I thought they'd be great. They'd grow up together. And my red buds, we're going on almost 8 years old, and they're pushing 12 to 14 feet tall. And my dogwoods are still 3 or 4 feet. So they were all planted. They were all the same size when I planted them 8 years ago. The dogwoods are just very slow growing. Part of that is some deer nipped the tops out of one of them and definitely stunted that one. But overall, slow growing tree, flowering dogwood. And I'll show a chart here in the next slide or two. And then at the very end, I'll have a link, which you can just Google it. It's much easier than following this convoluted link. But the Ohio Department of Forestry put together a really nice chart, and it shows things like growth rate, maximum size for many of our common species here in Ohio. If we jump up to medium growth rate, things like the sugar maple. So sugar maple, great yard variety. You'll find that a lot of the maples sold in nurseries under various cultivar names are either sugar maples or red maples, and then they have names like Autumn Blaze or Fall Sunrise, and they've been selectively bred for that brilliant leaf coloration in the fall. But even just your native sugar maples will still grow well around here and still present great fall color. And then lastly, here's that sycamore that I mentioned there a little bit ago. They are extremely fast growing tree that can reach tremendous sizes. So that's one, if they're a messy tree, which I don't highlight later, but that's when they have great big leaves, almost maple shaped leaves that come down. They persist on the ground like oak leaves. They don't decompose very rapidly. And then they have little fruits that can litter your yard. I think they're fantastic trees, fast growing, but they do come with their downsides if you're planting them in a residential setting, just because of the mess they can create during part of their growing season. So here's that chart I was referring to with the Division of Forestry, and this is just a screenshot of the chart. It's much larger than this, front and back. But it goes through here and you can see that it gives you that mature height. Again, the mature spread, which will be the widest anticipated branching pattern, regardless of shape. So regardless if it has that round shape or vase shape, that the furthest outreach those branches are going to get are kind of included here. And again, these are all just averages. Growth rates mentioned here, just again, slow, medium, or fast. They don't get real specific on that. If you see the thing where it says multi-stem, those are trees that have a kind of a tendency, instead of growing a single main trunk with branches coming out, they have multiple trunks that start at or near the ground level. So things like river birch, American arborvitae, or button bush here on this page, you're going to get those clusters of branches. So instead of again, one single main trunk, clusters of branches, which can, if you're looking for aesthetics and some things like that, can have some different appeals or unappeals depending on what your end goal is. Native or not, well drained. The soil thing, again, I'm not going to get into this real in depth because that's not my cup of tea, but this chart shows you what they prefer. And we'll talk about that soil stuff here in a little bit. And then of course there's benefits on if you want to provide food for wildlife or cover or use it as a windbreak type plant. But again, go back to that chart real quick. That's available, High Division of Forestry's website, and I'll give you the official name of it at the end if you just want to type that into Google when we're all done here and look that up for yourself and just download a copy of it to keep on your computer or print one out. So when we get into the site planning, and again, Carrie's going to talk about selecting the tree for your site. This is going to be more that initial where on my property is actually a good site to plant trees. And then from there, figure out what trees will work in that site. So, again, with Georgia the jungle here, we don't want to plant a tree where it's going to be in the way, whether that's in the way of just yard operations, whether when you're mowing, maybe you want your backyard to be able to have your kids or grandkids over to play frisbee or play ball, and you don't want trees popping up right in the middle of your main traffic area of your yard. And again, of course, some of the structures and some of the things we'll talk about. So here's one we see a lot in urban and even out in the rural developments. You've got the overhead utility lines, and someone's planted a tree directly underneath it. And again, we see this a lot more in towns and cities because that narrow strip of grass between the sidewalk and the street is typically in the easement for the village, and they plant trees in there. Of course, trees get big and eventually they encroach on the utility lines, and you end up with something that looks like this, where the utility companies don't want any interference on their lines, nothing damaging, so they do this hack pruning job, through no fault of their own, but you get left with a tree that looks very abnormal because it's pruned to get around those lines. And then of course, worst case scenario is storm damage or wind damage brings those trees into the utility lines, and you get loss of power, loss of phone, loss of cable, things of that nature. So I try to avoid planting near, whether it be directly under or even within reach of the utility lines. And I understand that depending on the size of your lot, that may be the only place you have available. But again, that's when you look back at that maximum size of the tree. So maybe if your only avenue is to plant directly under the utility lines, get a tree that's going to top out at 10 or 15 feet, and then it never becomes a problem regardless of how long that tree lives. Don't plant the oaks, don't plant the maples right there under the lines, because if they don't get pruned, like this, they may end up causing a problem later for you and your neighbors and maybe half the community. And then two different pictures here demonstrating kind of some different issues. Obviously, the one on the left, the only thing it's damaging in this case is the private fence. I'm assuming based on this picture that it wasn't a property line fence. Looks like it's in the front yard. But again, that tree's grown into that fence. That section of fence is basically going to be a permanent fixture there as long as that tree lives. Even if you decide to pull the rest of the fence out, as much as that's grown into the tree, it's permanently there until that tree comes down. Generally, that doesn't weaken the tree a whole lot. So I know there's concern of, well, does that fence growing in, or the tree growing into the fence or growing around the fence weaken the tree? Typically not in this case. That tree is going to kind of just swallow that up and embrace it. But again, it's damaging the fence, and it's making that fence stuck there. Now, on the picture on the right, I wanted to illustrate here. Again, we have one that's planted between the curb and the sidewalk. Doesn't appear to be any utility lines over top, and we can see that the tree blew over, took out the fence. But I wanted to kind of point out a problem with when you plant in a confined area like that. So that street there on the right-hand side of the picture has effectively girdled the roots or restricted the root growth. So when you think of trees and we picture that canopy, the branches outspread, your root structure of the tree is generally a mirror of the branches as far as the width. So we call that the drip line. So where the branches stop, in the in a rainstorm, the water would drip down the outermost branches and hit the ground. We call that the drip line, and that's where you could expect the root mass of that tree to extend out to, if not beyond that. Well, in this case, the curb of the road restricted the roots on that side. You can see those roots have stopped at a nice straight line, where the other ones have grown under the sidewalk and created a whole different problem that I'll talk about in a second. But those roots act as a counterbalance to the weight of the branches above. So when the wind blows or they get wet and the tree leans one direction or the other, those roots, being a mirror image of the branches above, help balance that tree out and prevent it from tipping over. Well, in this case, because the roots were restricted by the road, there was no grip, for lack of a better term, on that side of the tree. All the weight got pushed towards the fence, and it just popped the roots right up out of the ground because there weren't any growing out under the asphalt of the street. And then again, last thing I'll highlight with that other arrow pointing to where the sidewalk was being heaved as the roots grow and expand. They're growing in diameter just like the tree trunk, just like the tree branches. They will push up and heave the ground, and in this case have heaved the sidewalk. And in most municipalities, the sidewalk is public infrastructure, but the landowner is responsible for the maintenance of it. So if a tree growing there on your property damages the sidewalk, you're on the hook financially to repair that. So keep that in mind too, if you don't want to be footing the bill to replace the village or the city sidewalk down the road because of your tree roots. Another reason to just set those trees back from the sidewalk or from the street in that case. So just, I thought that was a great picture to illustrate two things in one shot there, with the root pruning by the road and then the roots heaving the sidewalk behind the tree. Here's another picture similar to that pine tree or that spruce tree that was growing up between the porch and the house. This is a fairly massive tree, looks to be probably a sycamore from what I can tell from the bark. Again, that tree is probably in the neighborhood of 60 or 70 years old, growing right next to that house. The roots are growing into the sidewalk, and in a matter of time, it'll be blocking half the entryway door, plus untold damage that those roots may be doing to the foundation. And eventually the tree will be rubbing into the house if it's not already on the back side that I can't see from the picture. But that's another one that was some poor site planning. And at this point, if you choose to get rid of that, you're probably hiring a very experienced crew to come in and start pruning it from the top down. And even then, that stump and root system is probably going to cause some pretty permanent damage to the house foundation and definitely to the sidewalk and different things. So again, I don't know how this tree was allowed to grow that long right adjacent to the house like that, but not something I would recommend. There's shrubs visible in this picture. That's their place next to the house. Stay away from the large trees that are going to continue to grow and present future problems. And of course, even planting away from the house, be aware, trees, especially here in Ohio, our prevailing winds tend to be out of the west. So if you're planting trees on the west side of your house that may reach of significant size and eventually, may produce a hazard to the tree or to the house of falling on it, just something to consider. I've got lots of trees growing due west of my house that if the time comes, they would probably end up on the roof of my house. That's a risk I'm willing to take, but just be aware that it is a risk. All right, and then so those were all the structures, utility lines that are overhead. There's also things going on under the ground that many of us probably just, it's out of sight, out of mind type thing. We don't consider that when you go to plant. Here are the main things. Again, if you live in the rural community, septic leach fields, very important for disposing of our household wastewater. You don't want to plant trees directly on top of that leach field, and then certain trees that prefer watery habitats like silver maple, bald cypress, willow trees. Those roots will actively seek water, and they will seek out your leach lines and eventually plug those lines and lead to sewer backups, which aren't any fun, and then expensive repairs down the road. So find out if you don't know where your leach bed is in your rural property, definitely figure that out. Contact the health department. You can look at old aerial photos and discover that. Know where that is. Avoid that pretty much at all costs, regardless of tree size. Buried utility lines. Again, when you're planting a tree, whether it's a seedling, whether it's one of those larger bald and burlap trees that you're digging a 2 feet deep hole, it's always advised to do, call the Utilities Protection Service 811. Even if you're just hand digging with a shovel, find out where those utility lines are. You don't want to hit whether it's a gas line or underground electric or telecommunications, whatever it may be. Definitely fiber optic. That gets expensive if you cut one of those in half with a shovel or a post hole digger. Know where they're at. Even if your tree roots grow and don't affect that gas line at all, at some point there's an easement there, and that utility company may have to come back in and replace or repair those lines. And in the process, they're not going to care if a tree's there or not. They're going to rip it out. So again, long-term investment, protect your investment, keep them out of those easements for those buried utility lines. And just that way the utility companies don't come in later and rip out your tree that you've invested 15 or 20 years in getting up to a sizable thing. And that's rural or municipal. So for those folks that live in town, you're going to have gas, electric, sewer lines, all those things. Know where those easements are and where those utility lines are buried before you start digging a hole and planting trees. All right, real quickly, again, on the soils and drainage, not going to get into and bore you with the details on this, but I just do want to show you where this information is available. Some of the things you can tell: moisture holding ability. That's what we talk about drainage class. How long does that moisture stay in the soil before it drains away? Fairfield County has a wide variety of soil types. If you're living up near the Baltimore area, those are very clay heavy soils. That's where I grew up. My family's still mostly from around there. Very, very rich in clay, which fantastic if you want a pond, not so much if you just want the water to drain away. So there's, that soil will really hold the water. pH of soil, that's something. The soil testing, Carrie and the folks down at OSU Extension offer soil test kits and instructions on how to collect that soil to send it out to have that sampled. We get those phone calls a lot because soil is in our office's name, but we don't do the soil testing. That's through OSU Extension. The web soil survey, which I'll show here in just a second, is a great online resource for finding all kind of information about the soil in your area. There are some restrictions. I have here in parentheses rural lots. Most of our soil surveys were first conducted in the early 1900s after many of our municipalities, our cities and towns were already established, and the soil in an urban environment has been disturbed so much beyond its original source that the soil surveys really don't cover that. They just kind of describe it all as undefined. So the soil surveys aren't going to be a big help if you have an in-town lot, but out in the rural countryside where it was probably formerly agricultural field 50 or 60 years ago, most of those are represented on the web soil survey, but precision is pretty vague on that. But I'll show you that here in a second. And then depth to bedrock, again, Fairfield County, a lot of variation. The northern and western parts of the county that were glaciated thousands of years ago, that depth to bedrock isn't an issue. You could dig down 50 to 500 feet before you hit bedrock. But I know here in Lancaster and then further south towards Sugar Grove, where you're getting into the unglaciated spots, there's portions of bedrock that are exposed right here in Lancaster. Mount Pleasant's a famous example of that. So when you're planting a tree and you start to dig a hole and you dig down 8 inches and hit solid sandstone, that may restrict what trees would grow on that site. So soil surveys will tell you that. You may just know that from digging around in your own backyard, but that's something to consider. And again, a little bit more on drainage, ponding, surface flow patterns, which is where basically when it rains and that water doesn't soak into the soil and runs off on the surface, we call that sheet flow. Where does that go? So you might not want to plant a tree directly in the path of that, as that tree grows larger and blocks that water flowing off your yard, it could back that water up into your foundation, into your basement, or onto your upstream neighbor and create problems. So we deal with that quite a bit at our office, where things are blocking that flow of water. So be aware when you're planting a tree, not only may it drown the tree out, but you may create those flow issues that affect your neighbors or your own property. So here's the kind of the home page, if you will, of the web soil survey. So if you just Google or search up web soil survey, it's run by the United States Department of Agriculture. It's good for anywhere in the United States. So this survey is applicable anywhere in the United States. And the main screen, when you start, right here's the big green button. They put it right there, and it sets you on the right path. So when you click that, you're going to bring up basically a Google map, and this is a zoomed in version. So this is after I've already went through 3 or 4 steps to create a soil map. But you can zoom in to your property, wherever that is, whether that's, again, in town. Probably not going to show you much information on this website, but I picked a rural lot here to give you an idea. You draw a box around the area that you want to survey, and in this case, I kind of followed the property lines on the auditor's website. So I pulled up just the soil survey for this parcel, and then created the soil map. And you can see it lists, there are basically 2 soil types on here, a Bennington and a Centerburg. The various different types you see are just the slope. So how flat or sloped is the ground? Was that soil previously eroded, which means is some of the topsoil lost, or is it true undisturbed soil? You'll find a lot of places here in Fairfield County has been eroded to some extent, but it breaks it down on what those soil types are, and then you can find further information. So if I select this Bennington A, this silt loam, and we pull up the soil details of that. So in the soil report, it'll give you the details, and a lot of information here to unpack. But again, when we talk about drainage class and different things, if you scroll down to the properties and qualities, and I can't remember if I highlight that, so I'm not going to hit my next button here. But if you get down there to properties and quantities, you can see it says drainage class, in this case, somewhat poorly drained, which means that water is probably going to lay there in the soil for a while and not percolate through very quickly. So some trees, when we talk about, do they like wet feet? Do they like the roots laying in water or in moist soil for extended periods of time? We would need trees that would have that growth characteristic. If some trees like sandy soil, where that water just goes right through after it rains, this soil would not be ideal for those type of trees. So, and again, profile there, we see silt loam, and then we see where it starts to mention the clay. So silty clay loam, and then finally down into that 42-inch to 80-inch depth, we're at a clay loam. So a lot of clay in this Bennington soil makes it poorly drained. Runoff class tells you it's high runoff because it takes a long time for that water to soak in. So when it rains, a lot of that water is just running off the surface. So a lot of information available in the web soil survey. And I'm not going through all the steps. That's something, if you have questions on how to figure out the web soil survey, how to walk through it, and you need some help, feel free to give me a call at the soil and water office, and I can just walk you through it on the phone. Once you figure it out, it's pretty simple, but I know that the first time or two, it can be daunting to figure out the controls. All right, yeah, I guess I did have errors pointing to the drainage class there. I was afraid to hit that next button. But so there you go, drainage class in this Bennington soil, somewhat poorly drained. Another way that I like to look, and Carrie used to work here at the soil and water office, and she knows we use aerial photos a lot. And this was just an aerial photo I pulled straight off of Google Earth or Google Maps. Same parcel that we just dealt with, just an older photo from Google that's taken during the winter time. You can see there's no trees on the, or no leaves on the trees, no crops growing in the field there. But what I want to highlight is you can see the darker areas of the lawn where the grass is still green. Those are areas where the water tends to concentrate on these parcels. And I highlighted them here in blue, and I'm going to toggle back and forth here a couple times. You can see the difference, but that's the image you would see on Google Earth. So you can see those dark areas. Those are areas of this yard that lay wet a lot throughout the year. So again, poorly drained. We saw that up from the Bennington soils. Centerburg's somewhat poorly drained as well. So these are areas to be aware of. If you're going to plant trees, know what areas of the yard are going to hold water throughout the year. plant the trees that are conducive to that. So again, these are our wet areas. And then I highlighted one patch that stays pretty much dry all year. And you can see it's kind of that tannish color. The grass there is completely dormant in this winter picture. So again, if I have some upland tree species I want to plant, something maybe like a shagbark hickory or certain oak species that prefer to grow on the hilltops, like those drier soils, that's going to be one of my few spots in this yard that I could plant those. Other trees that like the wet soil, again, some of our maples, some of our ashes, willow trees, cypress trees, go for those blue areas on the map. They're going to excel in those areas because of the wet soil conditions. All right, and then kind of to wrap up my thing before I turn this over to Carrie, the aesthetics of the tree. So again, plant it where you're going to enjoy looking at it. Messy trees, highlight a couple trees that can create messes, and then real briefly talk about a few of our toxic species that can create growth problems for other trees and plants around them. And I use this picture, took this picture actually off my mom's front porch. She enjoys sitting out there in the evenings, taking her evening cup of tea or whatever, and watching the sunsets. So this would be a case where maybe you don't want to plant a tree there. Maybe the aesthetics of this site is being able to see the sunset. So you don't want to plant a tree there that will eventually block the view. And I see that a lot of times too on folks with maybe a lakefront lot or a lot that borders some water. They enjoy looking out over the water, watching the ducks and geese, birds, whatever it may be. Keep that in mind that you plant that tree and it doesn't obstruct the view today, but 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, or 30 years down the road, that tree may completely block out that view that you so enjoyed before. So keep that view in mind. And then when it comes to trees, also go the other way. Maybe you have a neighbor's house that you don't enjoy looking at, and that's where that visual sightline break of planting trees between you and a neighbor or you and some other thing where creating a visual barrier is ideal. And some trees are more messy than others. These are two that I see a lot. And this again is just the fruit of the trees. We've got the honey locust on the left, Osage orange or hedge apples, as people like to call them, on the right. These trees drop these fruit pretty much every fall. They can create a mess more so than the leaves. I use the hedge apple as an example because when they come down, those things can weigh upwards of a pound or more. That's a pretty average size example that I'm holding in my hand there. You plant a tree next to where you park your car or next to a tin roof shed, those things falling from the trees can create some significant damage, whether it be to the tin metal of the roof or the sheet metal of your car, or I've seen busted windshields where these things come toppling down from a tree that's 30 or 40 feet tall and land on top of a car. Not to mention grown over a sidewalk and the risk of bludgeoning some poor pedestrian as they stroll under your tree. Keep that in mind with some trees. Others, leaves are always a consideration, but unless you go with an evergreen that doesn't drop needles, leaves are just going to be an issue we're all going to have to deal with the deciduous nature of most of our trees here in Ohio. But just know that some trees are messier than others. And then lastly, kind of a quick vocabulary lesson. This is one you'll see pop up when we talk about trees quite a bit. And I am not an English major and I don't know how to translate the pronunciation. And I've probably been pronouncing this wrong my whole life. So if you know the proper pronunciation, feel free to correct me. I've always called it allelopathy. I've heard people call it allepathy, whatever. Basically, it means that tree produces a chemical toxin that inhibits the growth of competitors around it. It's a survival mechanism, keeps competition from growing next to it, and whether that be other trees, whether it be the grass of your yard, or if you're having trees planted next to gardens, it can restrict the growth of your garden plants. Some of this in black walnut is a prime example, and the toxin that it produces is called juglone. Their genus name is juglans, is how they got that name. But it has very strong toxic effects on tomato plants. So try to plant tomato plants near a black walnut, you're going to struggle to get them to even grow, let alone grow enough to produce, edible tomatoes. The toxin doesn't enter the fruit at all. It's not toxic to us. It's more of a toxicity to other plants. A few others that I'll mention that have this allelopathy tendencies. ones that we strongly discourage. It shouldn't be something that you have to worry about planting, but things like ailanthus, also known as tree of heaven, our bush honeysuckles, and garlic mustard. So if you've noticed places where especially bush honeysuckle grows, there's nothing else growing under those shrubs. And it's because of this allelopathic toxins that they release into the soil through their roots, through their leaves. As their leaves fall in the autumn and then decompose, they release that toxin right into the soil, and it prevents anything else from growing in that area. So just keep that in mind. If if you want to plant a black walnut grove for future timber harvest, just know that those trees, just by their nature, are going to restrict the growth of other plants and trees around them. And then finally, again, just give you an example of a giant tree growing here in central Ohio. That's me in the lower right of that first picture. 20 years ago, with a coworker when I used to work for the Metro Parks, this is a giant sycamore tree that's growing up in the Powell area along the Olentangy River. At the time, it was on private property. Now it's part of the High Banks Metro Park. If you get a chance to get up there and view it, at one point it was the world champion, largest known sycamore on the face of the earth. It's been since surpassed, I think, by another tree here in Ohio, even for diameter. But that's quite massive tree. You can see the second picture. My friend standing up in the crotch of that branch, something like 15 or 20 feet off the ground. My friend's over 6'3" in height, for just to give you a scale on how big this tree is. So if you want to see a truly large tree here locally without traveling out to see the redwoods of California, sycamores can get massive, and there's a truly large example right here in Columbus. And then here I told you that link for the Division of Forestry guide. I don't expect you to type that thing out, but just if you Google or search up the bare root tree planting guide and species table for the Ohio Division of Forestry, that'll send you to that website and get you on the right track. Again, there's the web soil survey link, and then my contact information. So if you have any further questions, need help finding any of this information, or again, want to go through the web soil survey process and can't figure out how that website works, feel free to give me a call. I'll walk you through it step by step, and we'll get you going from there. Or I can even create the soil profile and just email you a copy. So I think that is it. I am going to attempt to unshare my screen now and send it back over to Carrie.
All right. Thank you, Tommy. So as Tommy was presenting, I put a couple links in the chat for you, that web soil survey, and I attempted to upload the PDF of the bare root tree planting guide. So hopefully both of those things are there. If not, we will send a follow-up email after this program and we'll include those links, as well as our copies of our presentations as well. So, all right. This goes here. So thanks to Tommy for reviewing those important considerations as far as what to keep in mind when you are selecting a tree for your site or a site for your tree. So now that we know about some of those conditions, and hopefully you've kind of thought about how that relates to your own yard, we're going to take a look at the trees that are available this year in the Soil and Water Tree Sale. So we're going to start out by just quickly highlighting each of the trees, and then we're going to do kind of a deep dive on 7 of those species. This is a screenshot directly from the Soil and Water Tree Sale Order Guide. So the brochure that has the tree selection in it, it classifies each of the species by growth rate, light required, soil moisture, and soil pH. So just kind of this is the key to kind of keep in mind, because we will see the characteristics of each of these each of the trees that are included in the tree sale. So I decided to classify these by soil moisture, because I figure you probably have an idea of the wet areas in your yard, those areas that have to be really dry before you go over with a mower, or areas that are maybe raised. So because of that, they have a drier soil moisture. So we're going to start with the species that are appropriate for areas that are wet or have more of a medium moisture. The first one is black willow. So black willow is it's a really shrubby tree. Some people might classify it as a shrub because it's so multi-stemmed. As far as the distinction between a shrub and a tree, it just kind of depends on who you ask. There's different definitions for a tree. I know that one that I heard recently I kind of liked was if you can walk under it, it's a tree. If you have to walk around it, it's a shrub. So, anyways, do what we will with that definition. But a black willow is going to be as wide as it is tall. It has a very fast growth rate. Its light requirement is all over the map. So it can grow in full sun, full shade, and anything in between. You'll often find it growing along ponds and streams because it is a thirsty plant. It loves water and it drinks a lot. So it does well in those wetter areas, but it can also do okay in areas that are not necessarily wet all of the time. So that being said, do not plant this tree close to your house or your foundation or your pipes, or if you have tile drainage in areas, because those roots will find those pipes and clog those pipes, or find your foundation and start to try to break through that foundation. They are very thirsty plants, like I said, so make sure that they are far away from areas where you don't want roots to invade. But definitely serve a purpose, especially within those natural areas. So next up is Ohio buckeye. So the ones that you see that are outlined in red, those are ones that I'm going to do a deeper dive on here in a little bit. The Ohio buckeye, of course, is our state tree. Okay. It gets about 40 feet tall and just about as wide. So this is kind of it's definitely a true tree, but it can definitely be a wide tree, especially at that canopy. It generally, it grows as an understory tree. You can plant it in full sun, but there's some caveats there. And once we talk about Ohio buckeye, we'll talk about what those caveats are a little bit. But it's a great, it's a great tree. It's definitely iconic here in Ohio. It's our namesake. Definitely was excited to see it as a selection in the tree sale this year. And finally, eastern white cedar. So this is also known as arborvitae. It is very popular in landscaping. So it is kind of an ornamental tree. It can grow up to 45 feet tall with a 12 to 15 feet width. So it's has more of a narrow characteristic to it compared to some of the species we're going to talk about. A medium to slow growth rate, and prefers a soil pH that is in the neutral range. So next up, these are the tree species that prefer more of a medium soil moisture. And the first one is American hazelnut. So we will talk more about American hazelnut. This is one of my favorite plants of all time. Oops. So I was really excited to see it in the tree sale this year. It is a fast-growing shrub. It grows nearly as wide as it is round, and it can grow in sun or partial shade. I've even found it in full shade in naturalized areas. It is an understory plant, and it prefers a neutral soil pH. American elm can grow to heights of 80 to 80 feet. It has a huge canopy, so you have to make sure that if you choose this tree, you have room for that big spread that's going to be up on top. It's a fast grower, and it also prefers a neutral soil pH. The gray dogwood. So this is a thicket forming shrub. It is great for attracting pollinators and birds. It can thrive in partial shade. This is more of a kind of an understory species, or really I feel like you find this a lot along wood edges or fence rows. And it can thrive in partial shade, and it also prefers a neutral soil pH. Redbud. So Tommy mentioned redbud in his presentation. This is a shrubby tree that it's a real looker. So this is a good looking plant, and we're going to take a closer look at this one in just a moment, but it grows nearly as wide as it is tall. around 30 feet, and it prefers more of an acidic soil. Sugar maple, of course, this is an iconic tree. It can grow in full sun, part shade, or full shade. So you'll find sugar maples kind of in the understory, competing for canopy light within woodlands, but it also makes a great landscape tree. It prefers an acidic pH, but it's adaptable to different pHs, and it has a great fall color, of course. And you can tap it for maple syrup once it gets to a larger size, bigger of a higher age. White pine. So this is a fast-growing evergreen conifer. It can grow up to 80 feet tall. It does best in full sun with a soil pH of neutral to acidic. It can provide great shelter for wildlife and is popularly used as a windbreak. And finally, shingle oak. So shingle oak is one of the species that we're also going to do a deeper dive on. But this is another tall growing species with a nice wide canopy. It has a medium to slow growth rate. And it's like most of our oaks, or really all of our oaks, they're going to do best in full sun. It can tolerate partial sun, but oaks are really a genus that needs that sunlight. Medium soil moisture and more of an acidic soil pH. There are a few species that are medium to dry. So it kind of overlaps with that last category, which were medium, but these are able to tolerate even drier sites than medium moisture. Black walnut is one of them. So this can grow very tall, up to 100 feet with a 100-foot canopy, so another really large tree. It can grow in sun or partial shade. And it prefers acidic to a neutral soil pH. Its roots, stems, leaves, fruit, basically all parts of this plant, as Tommy said, contain a substance known as juglone, and that's that chemical that inhibits the growth of certain plant species. Now, there are many species that are tolerant of juglone, meaning that they can grow really close to a black walnut, but there are some species that don't do well at all. Tommy had shared that a lot of our garden plants, such as peppers and tomatoes, are very susceptible to this toxin, so not something you want to situate close to your garden. I believe fruit trees as well are susceptible to this toxin, so you're not going to want to plant a black walnut in your apple orchard or close to your apple orchard, for instance. But you can find a list online of plants that are susceptible or tolerant to the chemical within black walnut just by Googling it. And I know that when I Google things, I always at the end, so I might Google black walnut juglone extension or .edu just to ensure that you're getting a resource that is factual and research based. American plum. So we'll take a closer look at American plum. So this is a shrubby tree. It has fragrant flowers in the spring that develop into edible fruit later in the year. And they do produce little plums. So this is our native plum. And then finally, last but not least, these are the most flexible of the tree species. So they are able to grow in virtually any soil moisture level. And I'd say out of all of them, bald cypress is the #1 most adaptable because this tree is able to grow in swamps with standing water, and it can grow in soils that a lot of us have in our yards, which is kind of a dry, hard, crappy clay type filler soil. So bald cypress is very adaptable. And I was really excited to see this one on the list this year. I'm definitely gonna plug a couple in my yard. I've been kind of thinking about where I want to do that. It is a long-lived tree, and it does best in full sun and prefers an acidic soil pH. And last but not least is white oak. We'll take another closer look at white oak as well. This is, of course, an iconic tree here in America. It can also grow just about anywhere in terms of soil moisture. It's important to note that this cannot withstand swampy areas. So you're not going to want to plant a white oak where you have standing water, but if you have soils that kind of stay kind of moist, the white oak is able to tolerate that. It wouldn't be a good choice within areas that that really stand wet after a rainfall, for instance. It prefers partial to full sun, and it has a neutral soil pH. All right. Oops. So after hearing Tommy's presentation, you should kind of have a better idea of your own site conditions and some factors to keep in mind when selecting a tree species that fits your space. So we're going to take a closer look at 7 tree species. Those are the ones that had the red border in those previous slides, and the considerations that should be made when with planting each of them. So we'll start with the smallest species, and then we're going to work our way up to the larger species. And we're going to start with American hazelnut. So American hazelnut can reach heights of 16 feet with a width of heights of spreads of 13 feet. And though this time of year the plant is free of its leaves because this is a deciduous species, it's still really interesting to look at. And that's because of these catkins that you see hanging from the limbs of the hazelnut. So these are actually the male flowers. They are produced a year ahead of time on the plant, and then they just literally hang out all winter long. In the early spring, on a day quite like today probably, they will elongate to approximately twice their current size, and those male flowers that line that catkin will open up and release pollen. So these are the wind dispersed flowers, and they're on that same plant. There are female flowers that are kind of small, kind of inconspicuous, but if you ask me, they're pretty darn cute. They kind of look like a troll doll laid on its side. And it should be noted that they don't self-pollinate well. So even though the same plant is going to have separate male and female flowers, as far as fruit production, you're going to do best by having more than one individual so that they are able to pollinate each other. So at least 2 separate shrubs are going to be your best bet if you would like to produce fruit. So speaking of fruit, these, upon pollination, the female flowers will develop into these interesting looking fruit that begin green, kind of with this rosy glow and these kind of red tipped hairs. And then eventually later in the season, they will dry out, and lo and behold, inside is the hazelnut. So they're contained in these are bracts, actually. They're modified parts of the flower that cover those nuts. And then eventually when those dry out, the nuts are revealed, and then they're accessible to all forms of wildlife, including people also. In the fall, it actually has pretty nice fall color. So you can see in that top left picture there, some of the rosy pinks and oranges and yellows. So really this shrub rather, has something to offer year round. So considerations for American hazelnut. This is also known as the American filbert. Some people just call it hazel, some people call it hazelnut, but it is adaptable to different soil moistures, but it really likes a well-drained site. It'll do well in both full sun and full shade. So this could be something that you might choose as a specimen plant that you put into your landscaping, but it also does well along your woods edge. So lots of possibilities as far as sunlight goes. It's highly tolerant of urban pollution. So because of that, it makes itself a plant that is able to be used as for instance, a hedgerow in more urban areas. It develops a broad, rounded, strongly suckering growth habit. So that means that as it grows, its roots are going to send stems up around the plant. So it turns into a true shrub. If you kind of think how like a raspberry would grow, for instance, sending up those shoots from the roots. That's what this is doing also, except it's not armed like a raspberry. It doesn't have prickles, but it does tend to fill up a space. If you want to keep it more defined, you can do that through pruning. You can even mow around the area if you want to keep those suckers down. That's fine too. So it can be tamed, but if it's in a natural area, it can fill up a space also. It's a good choice for hedges and screening or a natural forest setting. And of course, they're known for their tasty nuts that provide food for humans and animals. The hazelnuts that you find at the store are European varieties. They're selected for their larger size, but if you can beat wildlife to American hazelnut, these are just as tasty. And some folks say that they're even sweeter than the European varieties that you're going to find at the store. So very cool plant. So next up is American plum. So Prunus americana, also known as wild plum, and it is present throughout all of Ohio, and it's native to most of the eastern and central United States. So it is a member of the rose family, along with plants like service berries, chokeberries, hawthorns, crabapples, cherries, pears, roses, and of course other plum species. And like I had said earlier, its mature height is up to 25 feet, but it fills a space. So this is a very shrubby tree, and it's a very fast grower as well. It has these pungently sweet blossoms that emerge in the early spring, even before it leaves out. And later in the season, those flowers will ripen to these fruit that start out green and eventually ripen to this really pretty kind of plum color, because these are our native plums. They're about an inch or two long, or an inch or two wide, and they are edible for people and for wildlife. So some things to consider if you choose the American plum. It is very adaptable to different soil conditions and pH levels. It tolerates dry soil. And when I was doing research on this species, I found, I think it was actually an ODNR website. And they, I quote them as saying that it thrives on neglect in full sun. So I think that in itself speaks a lot. This is something that perhaps it's not your best specimen tree, but I think it definitely, has a place within the landscape as being a tree that gives you some nice color in the spring and also has some good wildlife benefits. So like I had said, it forms these big colonies or thickets in fields, fence rows, along roadsides. It's also going to sucker from the roots, like that American hazelnut. So it might be something that requires pruning, depending on where you have it. And it's able to kind of create this layered mass planting, similar to what you might see with a sumac. The fruits are sweet when they're fully ripened. I've been told they make excellent jelly or jam due to their high pectin and high acid content. So if this is something, if you like to spend time in the kitchen using some of these fruits that you harvest, this could be a good choice for you. It does attract pollinators and birds. So pollinators in the early spring, especially some of our native bees that are out earlier than our European honeybees, for instance. And of course, birds in the fall when that fruit ripens. But it's also good to keep in mind that, like all members of the rose family, it's prone to a host of diseases and pests, such as brown rot, black knot, and bacterial leaf spot. So not all of these are diseases that are going to kill the tree, but it might make it, for instance, defoliate earlier in the year than some of your other species. So just something to keep in mind when you are considering a location for American plum. All right, so redbud. This is the beauty queen of the group. And it is quite the looker. So this is, like Tommy had said, it's a small tree slash shrub or multi-stemmed tree. It can reach heights of 30 feet. Typically it has that vase-like growth habit. But as Tommy said, that, it doesn't read the rule books. So it might kind of go this way and that. But in any ways, in any order, that canopy is going to take up some space. So definitely something to think about. It has a medium to fast growth rate. Typically when this is when the trees are young, especially when they're in full sun, they grow pretty quickly, and then that growth rate slows down as they get older. The more sun this species gets, the more you're going to see flowers in the spring. It has these really beautiful heart-shaped leaves that are kind of papery thin. And it is a legume. So those flowers, upon pollination, will develop into these green pods. So it's a member of the bean family, along with honey locust, Kentucky coffee tree, black locust, and wisteria. And then later in the year, those will ripen to these brown pods. And a lot of times those will persist even into the wintertime. So considerations for the red bud. It does prefer deep, moist, organic, well-drained soils, but it is adaptable to less than favorable conditions. Just know that might shorten its lifespan though, and we'll talk more about that here in a moment. It grows most rapidly and flowers most prolifically if it has full sun and adequate moisture. It is beneficial to native bees, and that's both of its leaves and its flowers. So the redbud flowers are visited by many types of pollinators, but only long-tongued bees are able to actually reach the nectar that's in the back of those flowers. And due to their papery thin nature, those redbud leaves are a favorite among native leafcutter bees. So you may have noticed this in a redbud leaf or another leaf in your yard. It almost looks like somebody came through with a hole punch and punched out these almost perfectly rounded holes, these discs from the leaf edges. And that's actually these female leafcutter bees. They'll use their mandibles to snip small discs from the leaf edges, and then they'll collect those leaf fragments. They'll roll them up like a little cigar, and they will find a hollow cavity where they actually stuff those in. And each of those cells, they have a single ball of pollen and nectar and a single larval offspring. And then that is the first meal of that offspring once it hatches. So the damage that is occurred to the tree because of this species does not harm the tree. It's just a minor curiosity. And I feel like when I see this on trees, it's a good sign because it means that it is contributing to the ecosystem. So like I said, rapid growth, especially when it's young, but it is often short-lived. And that's typically when it's planted in areas that are not ideal. So I don't know about you, but my yard at home it's made of mostly poorly drained, heavy clay soil. So I could plant a red bud, but it would just be kind of important to keep in mind that it's probably not going to have the same lifespan as a red bud that is planted in an area that has that moist, organic, well-drained soils. It is susceptible to different diseases, especially when it's in those poorly drained conditions. So that it could include trunk canker, verticillium root wilt, and root rot. So just something to think about. I'm not trying to dissuade you from purchasing this tree, but kind of think about where you might want to place it and the lifespan of the tree as well. All right, so next up is one of our most famous trees. It is the Ohio buckeye. Of course, it is our state tree, and in nature, it is primarily an understory tree found in the western half of the United States. I'm sorry, the western half of Ohio, where the soils are more alkaline in pH. It can grow up to 40 feet with a similar spread, depending on if it's grown as an understory tree or as an open tree. So that's going to determine how large it gets. They have these showy yellow-green flowers in the early spring that emerge either before or with the foliage. They have these stamens, so the stamens are the pollen-bearing structures that really stick out far from the petals of the flower. And whereas a yellow buckeye, which is another native buckeye, its stamens are not nearly that long. So that's one way that you can tell this species apart from the yellow buckeye. They have these oppositely palmately compound leaves, which are pretty unique amongst our native trees here in Ohio. So what you see there is an entire leaf made up of 5 leaflets, and that's called palmately compound because you can kind of like picture a hand. not a lot of trees out there that use this leaf structure. So that's kind of cool. And the leaflets themselves are a little bit smaller and a little less wide compared to a yellow buckeye. So another characteristic that sets it apart from the yellow buckeye. I know that there's been a number of folks that have wondered which buckeye they have, and there are other buckeyes that it could be as well, and horse chestnuts and other things within Aesculus, which is the genus that these are found in. But as far as the Ohio buckeye, there are a few distinguishing characteristics, and that's one of them. So the fruits of Ohio buckeye are these capsules. They are spiky. Those spikes can really, there's a lot of variation in them. I have seen some Ohio buckeyes that just kind of, it's more of a wart looking thing than a spike. And then there's some out there that are truly kind of spiky. So lots of variation there. But within that capsule is the buckeye itself. So that is the seed of the plant. These capsules can occur singly, or they can be in clusters, and they enlarge and become more obvious in mid to late summer. The buds are very large and very sticky. And if you were to scratch the bark with a pocket knife or with your fingernail, you would notice a skunky smell. And that's another signature characteristic of the Ohio buckeye, is that skunky smell. You can't miss it. So both the leaf capsule and the seed, of course, are well known here in Ohio as being the mascot for Ohio State University. So some considerations if you would like to include the Ohio buckeye in your landscape. It prefers moist, well-drained soils, a variable pH. We're going to talk about sunlight here just in a moment, because that's where that caveat lies that I talked about earlier. It does have this neatly rounded tree, especially if it's growing in an open area with these sweeping branches, a really dense foliage. It provides deep shade. So it is a really good looking tree, especially earlier in the season. It's great for pollinators, especially for our native bees because of those beautiful flowers. It is prone to developing leaf scorch in midsummer, and that is especially going to be the case if it's in an area that is full sun and has a drier soil moisture. So irrigation can be helpful in preventing this leaf scorch, but another tactic that you could use is not to plant it in full sun. So if you are looking, if you are selecting mostly for good foliage, meaning you're looking for healthy leaves from mid to late summer, you're going to want to situate this tree in a partial to full shade area. If you are selecting for flowers and nut production, well, it's going to have more flowers and thus more fruit if it has more sun. So in that case, you're going to aim for more of a partial to full sun location. So it really depends on what your goals are for your landscape. All right, next up is bald cypress. So this is a really cool plant. And what you see here is its native habitat. So this is a true swamp species. You can see the range map up there. So this is the native range of the bald cypress. It does extend up into like the southwestern kind of little finger of Indiana, but this plant itself, as far as its native range go, is not native to Ohio. However, it has been successful in growing in Ohio and even reproducing naturally in Ohio, I have heard. So it's definitely hardy here, even though it is not necessarily native here. So it can grow to heights of 50 to 75 feet with a 20 to 45 foot spread. It is stately, it is large and in charge, and it's often found in groupings in parks and larger spaces along streets and around lakes. In that bottom left-hand picture, you see what are known as the knees of this tree. So these are these wooden protrusions, and the tree is typically only going to produce those if it's growing in an area that has standing water a lot of the time. So if it's in a drier area, you may never see the knees, but it's still a really cool plant. It produces these round cones, and eventually in the fall, those will turn to brown, start to disintegrate, and the russet fall color of its lacy needles, I think, is one of the most outstanding characteristics of this tree. So unlike cone-bearing trees, the bald cypress is actually deciduous. So it loses its leaves in the wintertime. Every year at the extension office, we get calls from folks saying, my pine tree just lost all of its needles at once. It must be dead. Well, the problem is their pine tree is not a pine. It is either a bald cypress, it could be a Don redwood or a tamarack. Those are two other species found in Ohio that are deciduous conifers. But rest assured, the species will, or this species will leaf out again in the spring and gain a new canopy. So considerations for bald cypress: it will adapt to a wide range of soil types. So whether it's wet, dry, or swampy, it can probably handle it. It does prefer full sun. It is important to keep in mind that it is deciduous, so it will lose its leaves in the wintertime. So if you are choosing this tree, for instance, for screening purposes, it may not be, your best bet. There may be a conifer that is an evergreen might be a better choice because it's not going to lose its leaves in the wintertime. It has this pyramidal spire-like growth, especially when it's young, but as it becomes older, that growth is going to open up some. So it'll start to take up more space as it gets older in age. Like I said, it's a great tree for clay soils, and it's relatively low maintenance. It's not a favorite of deer. Of course, I always say nothing is deer-proof, but it's not a favorite of deer. And it's really excellent at soaking up floodwaters and preventing erosion. So cool tree, glad to see it in the tree sale this year. So our last two trees that we're going to cover are all oaks. And oaks are often referred to as the king of trees due to the many uses and benefits they have to both humans and wildlife. So the first oak we're going to talk about is shingle oak. So this is primarily an oak of the Midwest. It was used by early pioneers because of how it is able to be narrowly split, so that wood was used as shingles for cabins, hence its name. And it will grow heights of 50 to 70 feet with a similar spread. So this is a tree that takes up a lot of space. It's a member of the red oak group, so it does, since it's an oak, it produces acorns. But since it's a member of the red oak group, it actually takes 2 years for acorns to mature. So you can kind of see there that protrusion that's right above the leaf on the bottom right. That is a first year acorn. And then the second year it actually matures to an acorn that is ready for consumption by a blue jay near you. Of course, these are not all the acorns on the plant are on the same cycle. So you're always going to have second year acorns that are being produced. Some years are going to be higher mast years than others, and that's just what oaks do. That's going to be the case with all oaks. So like I said, it prefers that moist, well-drained, acidic soils, but it's going to be adaptive to less than ideal conditions. It is subject to yellowing of the foliage if you plant it in areas that are more alkaline. So if you're unsure of your soil pH, we always encourage soil testing. Like Tommy said, we do offer soil testing kits here at the office. So get a hold of me if that's something you're interested in. It is a beautiful, rugged shade tree. It's got that broad, round habit. Really likes the sun, so plant this tree in full sun. It needs space. It's gonna be around for a while. And like all oaks, it's subject to the usual array of pests and pathogens that can affect many oak species. And like all oaks, it offers many benefits to wildlife as well. So a shingle oak provides great nesting habitat for many birds, as well as food for many rodents and bird species also. And the last species is white oak. So This is a very large tree. It can also reach heights of 100 feet, has a spread just as great. It's a medium to slow growing growth rate. It's one of the most important timber trees of the white oak group, and in fact, it's one of the most important hardwoods. It's heavy, it's hard, and it's tough. So it's used for things like beams, railroad ties, flooring, whiskey barrels, furniture. I know that my flooring at my house is made out of white oak. I listened to a podcast on trees. It's called Arbitrary. I recommend it. It's always you always leave the podcast learning a lot more than you knew when it comes to the tree species they're featuring. And I listened to the episode on white oak here lately, and they referred to the white oak as the Tom Hanks of trees. Kind of thinking about how I could explain that during this podcast, and I'm not sure I really can put it into words, but once you get to know this tree, you'll find it really is kind of fitting that this is the Tom Hank of trees. The reference fits. So this is, like I said, a large tree. It is, since it's a white oak, it produces its acorns over 1 year. So every year it's a fresh batch of acorns. Some years are going to have higher mass than others. It has a nice fall color, so kind of this russet red color, and it can get incredibly massive. So this is yours truly. I am pondering life underneath Logan's Great White Oak. So this is located in Logan, Ohio, in the old Logan Cemetery. It's definitely worth a day trip because it is on public land, and this thing is just incredibly large. It's said to be 500 to 600 years old. So that means that this tree was already 100 years old when the Mayflower reached America. So that really kind of puts some things in perspective. This tree has seen a lot. Some considerations for white oak. It does prefer those moist, well-drained soils, but it is able to adapt to other soil conditions, just not standing water. So it's not going to tolerate soils that are permanently moist. It is an important lumber tree, so it's used for a lot of different things out there. It needs space. It will, if it's happy, it will outlive you. It may outlive your children and your grandchildren. So this can be a very long-lived tree, and it offers many benefits to wildlife. So other than providing a huge boost in biodiversity, this is important if there's any birders out there, for instance. You'd be interested to know that over 90% of our songbirds depend on caterpillars, wiggly packets of protein to rear their young. And oaks are able to host over 500 different species of caterpillars, more than any other genus out there. So it really is the ultimate buffet, playing a keystone role in the ecosystem. So very important genus. Now I know we are past 1:30. I am recording this, so if you do have to hop off, I understand. I'd say we probably maybe have another 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes. We are recording this, so we'll send this out. But if you can stick with us, then please do. When it comes to planting a bare root seedling, because this is what you're going to get from the tree sale. It does, resemble a stick with roots, but these bare root seedlings are very much alive. And in order for them to succeed and reach a great old age of 500 years, for instance, it needs a good start to life. So there are some kind of best practices for planting a bare root seedling. So the first thing you're going to want to do is make sure that your hole is of ample size. So don't dig a little dinky hole for this, even though this tree might look little and dinky. Don't dig a little dinky hole. Make sure that the size of your hole is large enough and deep enough to accommodate the root system. Make sure that the roots themselves are untangled. You may have to prune some roots. The best practice is never to take more than 25% of the roots off. And you may not have to do any pruning at all. But if you have, for instance, a J root, which is a root that's kind of pointing the wrong direction because it's curved up, then obviously we don't want our roots to grow up because that could cause it to girdle the tree and kill the tree. So that might be something that you want to prune. And then you're going to place that seedling in the center hole at the correct planting depth, which we'll talk about that depth here in a second, and fill it with dirt, and make sure that dirt is tamped down gently. I know that I see pictures of people tamping it down with their foot. I'm always a little leery of that because you don't want to compact the roots either. So I always say use your hand, tamp that down to get rid of any air pockets, but you also don't want to compact the roots that you just planted. As far as planting depth, the root collar is going to tell you how deep to plant this plant. So the root collar is where the stem meets the roots. In some plants, it's more obvious than others, but I have some pictures up here so that you can see. But generally, when you really look at the plant, you can see where this line is, because all of these bare root seedlings were growing in ground, right? They were growing in landscape beds a lot of the time, and then were dug up. So basically, you're looking for the line of where it was originally planted, and then trying to reproduce that same depth with your hole. So some things that we often see, kind of starting at the top left, we have roots that are tangled and turned up. So that's something that we don't want, because that might cause this tree to girdle itself. The middle top, planted too shallow. Want to make sure that those roots are in the ground. Top right, that one's planted too deep. That's going to cause some possible rot on the stem of that plant, and definitely eventually cause loss of life. Bottom left, that has an air pocket, so that's one that wasn't tamped down well enough. Bottom center, planted on a mound. You want to make sure that those roots are in the ground rather than on top of a mound. And then the bottom right, that one is correctly planted. So following that root collar and using that depth. I don't have any pictures of it here, but oftentimes we see folks that do mulch volcanoes. That is a no-no. So we don't, after we plant that tree at its correct depth, you could keep any vegetation, grass and whatnot from around it. So kind of clear a radius around that tree, but you're not going to want to then pile on mulch. Make sure the mulch is not touching the bark itself. A couple other tips. Between the time you pick that tree up and put it in the ground, make sure those roots stay moist for every moment between then and now. So keep it in a cool location above freezing until planting if you're not going to plant it right away. If you need to buy yourself even more time, you can heel the plant in. So basically that means that you are giving that tree a temporary resting spot where you are, I guess, kind of like digging a trench and then burying the roots, and not with the intentions of keeping it there. So you can do that for a little bit of time, but eventually you do need to figure out where that final spot's going to be. When planting, ensure the roots are straight up and down. So you don't want those roots that are pointing to the sky. You want them all pointing to the ground. Protect it from browse, especially with these little trees. They're going to look really enticing to deer that are out in your yard. So make sure that they're protected somehow. So whether that be a tree tube, which I think are one of the options for the tree. So I think you can order a tree tube, but you can also order tree tubes through different catalogs. I know I've gotten some on Amazon before, so they're out there. You can use fencing, just find a way to protect that tree from browse. And of course, keep it watered, especially that first year. That's going to be when this tree is the most stressed. By planting it, this time of year, it does give it a little bit of time to get established before we get that those really dry summer days. But at the same time, we didn't expect it to be 75 degrees in February. So especially that first year, kind of baby this tree, especially if it's in an area that's in full sun, and keep an eye on it, keep it watered. And from there, I'm going to step aside and let Tommy cover some of the details around ordering from the tree sale this year.
Oh, sorry, I had to unmute myself there. Yeah, so Carrie brought up the what you see on your screen right now is Licking Soil and Water's website. Not to be confused with us, Fairfield Soil and Water. We partner with Licking. Licking actually coordinates the purchase of the trees from the nurseries, and they serve as kind of the central point for about 5 or 6 different soil and water conservation districts tree sales, and we're just one of those partners. So if you want to place your order online and pay with a credit card, you'll actually go to Licking Soil and Water's website, and then they'll have their tree sale, and you click on that banner, and it will start you down the order form path. One thing to make note of, because there are multiple partnering soil and water districts, you'll have to select what county you would like to pick the trees up in. So if you're planning on picking up the trees here at our office in Lancaster, make sure you select Fairfield County, and then it will bring up the order form. You can select whatever you want on the order form, pay for it with your credit card, and then on pickup day, which I'll give the dates here in just a second, all that stuff will be here at our office. We will go up a couple days before, pick all of the orders up at Licking's office, all the trees, any supplies such as tree tubes or dibble bars or things that people may order, bring those back to our office, and then we'll compile, separate out all the orders, and we'll do as we've done kind of post-COVID, basically a drive-through pickup. So our building has got a loop road, a driveway that goes around behind the building. We'll have signs up, pull around back, shout out your name, we'll find your order, bring it right out to you, and off you go. If you want to come in and talk to us, feel free. You can still come into the office and talk to us, but we'll be here on that day. So here's the order form itself. If you want to go to our website or stop in the office and pick up a paper order form, at our office we only accept check or cash. We don't have the ability to process credit cards. So again, credit card sales are online at Licking Soil and Water's website. This is the printable order form that you can mail in with a check or stop by our office and pay with a cash check that way. Again, order deadline here on the screen is March 17th. I will say that the online order deadline tends to be about 4 or 5 days later. So if you forget or want to have a last minute addition, you can go to Licking Soil and Water's website and order, I believe, a few days after this date. This is for in-person orders at our office. Pickup day is April 21st. And all the trees will be here at our office for that day. If you selected Fairfield for the online orders, or if you stopped in and ordered them directly. They do have to be picked up. We unfortunately don't offer shipping around the county. They'll be here. We do have extended hours that day. I believe we open at 7 that morning, and usually have 1 or 2 of us that will stay late into the evening till 7 or 7:30 on that Friday to accommodate folks that are also working and have schedules as such. And you can designate somebody else to come pick up your order and just come in and make sure that they tell us who they're actually picking the order up from. One thing I will mention regarding the order deadline, these trees, the way our sale works, Licking Soil and Water has purchased a finite quantity of trees. So the trees have already been purchased from the nurseries in a set number. So as the orders come in, they update that inventory weekly. So every Friday, Chris here at our office sends all the orders she's received for the week to Licking, and those orders, the quantities from those orders are deducted kind of from that running total. So in the past, some high demand species sell out before the deadline. So keep that in mind. This year, typically the Ohio Buckeye, always in demand, and then some of the new additions. So American Plum and Shingle Oak being a first time offering for this tree sale might garner some extra interest. So if you're considering getting one of those, the earlier you can get your order in, the better, and we'll get your kind of your quantity reserved for you. If you wait until that deadline, at that point in the sale, we may be sold out of some of these species. So you can always call in and check before you submit your order, just to make sure, especially if you're mailing it in and we may not get it for 3 or 4 days. Then we have to deal with refunds and all that fun stuff. So order deadline, hard deadline is the 17th. Get your order in as early as possible, and we can go from there. that's all I had for the tree sale. I did see a question in the chat earlier. Ms. Cassidy had a question regarding small maple trees. And I see Carrie's got some other stuff up here on the slide, but I want to go ahead and answer that question in case somebody has to get off here. Regarding small maple trees, so if you're trying to plant them in tight areas, generally when we talk of native maple trees for Ohio, there are 4 main species. All of those, unfortunately, get large, and those would be the sugar maple and the black maple, which are hard maples, and then the silver maple and red maple, which are more of a faster growing, tend to what we call our soft maples. They all get to be large sizes. There is another native to North American maple that is a small maple. It does creep, its natural range creeps into far northeastern Ohio, but it's mainly a New England species, and that's called the striped maple, Acer pennsylvanicum. So it would probably grow well here in central Ohio. It grows in, again, northeastern New England, United States, all through Pennsylvania. It's how it got its scientific name. And then in the northeast Ohio, we just don't see it much in the wild around here. But from what I could see, it tends to top out at that 20 to 25 feet maximum size. So striped maple might be something to look into. As far as non-native species, normally I don't tend to encourage those, but our Japanese maples that get some of the red or burgundy colored leaves, they from everything I've told or I've seen, don't tend to be invasive. So they're not a native, but they don't tend to escape and grow out into the, take over the countryside. Norway maples do tend to get invasive, so I don't recommend Norway maples, but Japanese maples are a smaller maple that would probably be okay. Again, not in our tree sale, but you can find those. And just happened to see another question pop up with, can you tap any maple tree? Does it have to be a sugar maple tree? I think is what you meant by that. No, you can technically tap any tree out there. Sugar maples are the most desirable just because they produce a lot of sap and they have a very high, relatively high anyway, sugar to sap ratio, meaning you don't have to boil down. I think it's still like 50 to 1. So you have to boil 50 gallons of sap to get 1 gallon of syrup. Some trees may be 100 to 200 to 1. And then some trees like oaks that are very rich in tannins, the syrup that you end up with may not be sweet at all. It may be very bitter. So you could probably tap the other maples. Again, black maple would be the most comparable to sugar maple, probably in that sugar to sap ratio. Your silver maples and red maples, again, are very watery sap, probably a very, very, very low ratio of syrup. So you'd have to extract much more sap to get any usable syrup out of it. But yeah, you can tap anything. Sugar maple tends to be the only thing tapped just because it kind of has that sweet spot, no pun intended there, of sugar to sap in the production of it.
And Susie, there is a lot of breeding and selection going on for maples. I know that up at OSU Mansfield, they have a sugar shack. So they produce maple syrup there, and they have some different plots that they are studying different cultivars of, I believe, sugar maples and red maples. Red maples are a really fast growing tree, but they don't have the sugar content, like Tommy said, that a sugar maple does. So kind of looking at that hybrids, so they kind of can have the best of same worlds, of both worlds. But like even box elder, we don't think of that as a maple because we don't call it a maple, but it is a maple. It's in the Acer genus, and even a box elder can be tapped. I've heard it has kind of like a molasses like syrup to it. So good question. Are there any other questions? You feel free to type them in the chat. You can also unmute yourself. That is fine also. All right. Well, real quick before we wrap up, I'm going to put a shameless plug in here for some upcoming programs that I would love to see some of you at. Our vernal pool exploration is coming up a week from tomorrow on March 3rd. It's going to be in Pickerington at Coyote Run. This is filling up very quickly, so I expect it to probably be filled up by the end of this weekend. It is limited to 40 people because the areas that we're going to be in are delicate areas and we want to reduce the impact in those areas. So if this is something that you're interested in, then I would encourage you to get signed up right away. It is free. On Friday, March 10th, I'm going to be hosting a webinar. It's a virtual spring wildflower hike. So this is part of Ohio Woodland Stewards program, and have lots of really great pictures of different wild spring ephemeral wildflowers. So you can kind of enjoy wildflowers from the comfort of your living room. If you're interested in fruit trees, we have an annual fruit tree pruning workshop at Hugus, and this year it falls on Saturday, March 25th. It starts at 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. It's a really great hands-on workshop. You have the opportunity to talk to Mr. Hugus about any questions that you might have when it comes to apple trees, peach trees, apricot trees. He is a wealth of knowledge, and it's a really great day to really, learn from the experts. On March 28th, Tommy and I are teaming up again to do a spring pond management clinic. So if you have a pond, or you think you might want a pond, then come join us the evening of March 28th. Eugene Bragg, who is our Aquatic Ecosystems Program Director for OSU, and a wealth of knowledge when it comes to ponds, is going to be there. So we would love to see you there. This is another free program. And last but not least, this is our Winter Tree ID. I think there's a couple of people here that attended the Summer Tree ID that we did at Coyote Run this past summer. So this is the Winter Tree ID version. It's going to be held on Friday, April 7th, which if we have many more days like this, then it's not going to be a winter program. But we kind of figured this way, it hopefully won't be bitterly cold outside, but most things won't be leafed out yet. So it is an all-day program. This is another Woodland Stewards program. So love to see you there. This is, I think, going to be a lot of fun. So if you're interested in any of those, you can go to go.osu.edu/FC events. There are registration links to everything there. And if you have any questions, always feel free to reach out to myself. So my contact information is there, and so is Tommy's. So are there any other questions?
Thank you very much. It was great.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sticking with us. Sorry we went over, but love talking trees. So appreciate the opportunity. Have a great day.
Thanks again.
Thank you.